Hey students, so this screencast is all about the names of the different bones. We now understand the anatomy of a long bone and what the long bones are made up of. We understand the physiology of how bones sort of grow and change over time and some of the repercussions of that for our bone health. Now we're just going to kind of go through and like what's the names of the bones, you know? If I point to a bone in my arm, which one is that? Um, this is something that requires a fair amount of memorization, and the more ways you engage with a topic, the easier it is to memorize. And so I would encourage you as you're watching this screencast to do something active to try and learn and retain the names of these bones. So I'd recommend that you click on this study guide. And if at all possible, if you could print this off, that would be great, because as you scroll down to the bottom, you see that there's these coloring pages. And you see number 1 frontal bone and then number 1, and you can color that, either pink as it says or just whatever color you want. But I think if you color code while watching this, we've got pictures of the skull, of the rib cage and vertebrae. We've got the arms, the legs. If you color while watching this and hearing me talk about it, I think you're just going to retain it a lot better. If you don't have a coloring packet, you may consider just like a simple, very simple sketch, like a stick figure kind of thing. I don't think it's going to be quite as difficult to draw this as maybe it might first appear if you just kind of draw rough outlines, but figure out some way to be active in learning this, and that is going to be really helpful. One other thing I want to point out about this, you'll notice that I've X'd out a handful of bones. That is an indication that you don't need to know that particular bone, so you don't have to worry about those. So let's just kind of go through and talk about the names of the bones. So the anatomy of the skeletal system. There are two kind of divisions of the skeletal system, the axial and the appendicular skeleton. So the axial skeleton is everything highlighted in orange here. It consists of the skull, the vertebrae, and the rib cage. Its main job is protection. The skull protects your brain, the vertebrae protects your spinal cord, and the rib cage protects your heart and lungs. The appendicular skeleton, which is highlighted in yellow here, are essentially the appendages. The main job here, movement for your arms and legs. So let's go through and take a look at the different bones here. So we start with the skull. The skull is there's a lot of bones there, right? So the skull is not just one thing. It actually starts as many bones that have kind of fused together into this structure, and they're all highlighted here. So the lab activity that we're going to do is going to go through them, but maybe I'll just highlight some of the major ones. This bone in orange in front is the frontal bone. And you can see that right here, the frontal bone. This next one here is the parietal bone in blue. Back here in orange is the occipital bone. And then here in red is the temporal bone. Now you'll notice that those perfectly match the lobes of the brain, which is quite handy. In addition, there's a few other ones. The zygomatic bone is in green. You can see that here. That you can actually feel is like your cheekbone right there. This yellow one in front is the maxilla. And that's basically your upper lip. You can see that right here. And then the lower jawbone is the mandible. You also have in blue the nasal bones. And then I forgot this purple one here is the sphenoid bone. So again, frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone, temporal bone, sphenoid bone. That's like your temple right there. The zygomatic bone, and then shifting to this picture here, the nasal bone, the maxilla, and the mandible. So there's other bones in the skull as well that I'm not asking you to learn, but these are kind of the major ones. One little side note that I wanted to point out, butt chin. I feel I'd be remiss in my duties as human anatomy teacher if I did not explain the physiological basis of butt chin. Basically, here's a picture of a shark jaw, actually. The jaw actually forms as these two halves that come together, and there's this little band of cartilage in between that kind of fuses the two halves together. And sometimes it doesn't fuse all the way across, and there's this little divot in there. So if you have that little divot in there, that's where that butt chin comes from. So there you go. In addition to those major bones, there are also little parts of the bones, and I have other videos with actual skulls in the activity section of the Schoology page that's going to go through these as well. But just briefly, I'll just go through them here. The foramen magnum is this big hole right here at the base of the skull. That is where the spinal cord goes through. The occipital condyles are these little bumps on the sides of that hole, and they're called occipital because they're part of the occipital bone. This is the base of the skull, by the way. Should have pointed that out earlier. So occipital condyles are part of the occipital bone, and the condyle just means these rounded knobs here. The styloid process, think stylus. It's kind of this long, pointy little bone right there. And the mandibular fossa. A fossa is a shallow groove, and this is where the mandible, that lower jawbone, attaches to the skull. The external auditory meatus is where your ears go in, and it's that little hole there. It's kind of a tunnel that goes in. The mastoid process is this little bump at the base of the skull. You can kind of feel it in the back of your head, kind of off to the side. Here's another angle that shows that styloid process again. Again, think stylus. Muscles of the tongue and some muscles involved in speaking attached to that. And then finally, the sinuses. You've got a frontal sinus right here, and then a sphenoidal sinus kind of right in here. And so this is where, if you have a sinus infection, that's where you feel the pain. A sinus is simply an air space, and you can see these little air spaces there. And that helps with resonance of your voice to help project your voice better. And a sinus infection is where bacteria or some other particles kind of make their way in there. Your body produces mucus to contain them, and then that mucus builds up in pressure. And so again, a frontal sinus infection would hurt here in the frontal sinus. Sphenoidal would hurt here. So those of you who've suffered from sinus infections may be familiar with those areas. So again, we're going to work with this a little bit more through some lab activities, but there they are, kind of in a nutshell. Couple interesting side notes. You might wonder, why do we care about these parts of bones? Why is there so much attention paid to it? Well, one example of why we would care, the foramen magnum is that hole at the base of the skull. And in humans, it's directly at the bottom. Well, in chimps, it's slightly further back because they kind of walk kind of hunched over like that. And in dogs, it's really far back because they walk on 4 legs. So the position of that foramen magnum can kind of tell you how a creature would walk. So imagine the shock on some researchers' faces when in the, I think it was the mid-70s, they dug up this skull in Africa, and it was a very chimp-like skull, but when they flipped it upside down, that foramen magnum was at the base of the skull. So just by looking at that hole, that told them that this creature must have walked upright just like humans did. And since it's very chimp-like in every other way, it kind of told them that, oh, apparently humans started walking upright before their brains got bigger and other human-like changes occurred. So, these little tweaks of anatomy can actually tell you quite a bit about creatures. So that's just one example I would care. Okay, other parts of the axial skeleton. The vertebral column is next, and there's different parts, of the vertebral column. The top vertebrae are basically in your neck. These are the cervical vertebrae. The next set is the thoracic vertebrae, and these are basically in your upper chest, your chest area. Every single one of these has a rib attached to it. So you have 12 pairs of ribs, and so there's 12 thoracic vertebrae. The lumbar is your lower back, and so you may have heard of lumbar supports, which kind of push back on your lower back a little bit to kind of help that curvature. The sacrum is kind of the butt bone, so to speak. So if you feel kind of borderline inappropriate in a school setting to reach back and feel the sacrum, but still probably okay. It's kind of right on the belt line. And then coccyx, you'd have to explore that on your own time. That's kind of way down there in the crack. It's basically the remnant of a tail. So it's just 3 to 5 tiny little vertebrae kind of fused together and at the base of that vertebral column. You don't need to know this, but there are actually 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar, and you can remember that because of the meal times. You eat breakfast at 7 a.m., lunch at noon, dinner at 5 p.m. And at this point, students usually say, who eats dinner at 5 p.m.? And you just think of it as a senior citizen plan. It's a great plan. I strongly advise it. Parents with small children also adopt this plan. You get into the restaurant by 5 p.m. There's no line. There's no way. You eat your food, you're off and running before it's time to go. Two more vertebrae I want to point out, the atlas and the axis. These are actually the first and second cervical vertebrae. And the atlas is called the atlas because it sits at the base of the skull and kind of holds the skull. It's like right at the base of the skull. So it's kind of like, I think it's a Roman Titan, Atlas, who holds the earth up. I think he's being punished for something and just basically hold the earth up. So the atlas bone is holding up the skull, so to speak. And these little faces, these little surfaces here attach to those occipital condyles that I mentioned earlier. The axis is the second cervical vertebrae, so it's like the second one, and it has this kind of protruding knob right here that kind of sticks through. One final interesting side note, you may be familiar with Christopher Reeve. He played Superman back in the 80s when the Superman movies weren't terrible, and he fell off his horse, I don't know, in the mid-2000s, early 2000s, I think, and became quadriplegic. He lost control of both his arms and legs. And the key place where you can, obviously a spinal cord injury is what causes that. And the key vertebrae for this is the T2, the second thoracic vertebra. And the reason why that is the magic one is because this is where the nerves to the arm branch off. So if you get injured above that line in your spinal cord, nerve signals from your brain can't get to the arms and they can't get to the legs. And so you're quadriplegic. If you damage the spinal cord below that line, then the nerves can branch off to the arms, but they can't get further down to the legs, and so then you're paraplegic. So you can use your arms but not your legs. So spinal cord injuries are obviously a big deal because that means that you're blocking nerve signals to lots of parts of your body. Another thing about the vertebral column, you may have heard of a herniated disc. And what that is in between each vertebrae, you have these little discs. And if, through injury or overuse, those discs can kind of squish and get compressed and then kind of bulge outward. And if they do that, they can push on a nerve, which can cause enormous pain. Okay, finally, the ribs. You have 12 ribs. They connect through cartilage to the central bone called the sternum. There's different names. There's, for example, true ribs each have their own little piece of cartilage attaching to the sternum. And then you've got these false ribs down here, 8, 9, and 10 sort of all merge into a single connector to the sternum. And then 11 and 12 are just floating. They don't attach to anything. That then brings us to the appendicular skeleton, which is our arms and legs. Pectoral girdle refers to the shoulder area. The clavicle is the bone kind of right in at the top of your chest. You can kind of feel it kind of going horizontally across. It's sometimes called your collarbone. The scapula is your shoulder blade on the back, top of your back. The humerus is the upper arm bone, and you can see it's got a fairly, rounded head here. And then the radius and ulna are the lower arm bones. The radius is, you can think of the radius, the way to remember that is this head is actually circular in shape. So think of the radius in a circle. And it's also in line with your thumb here. So is that right? I don't know. I'm trying to draw a letter R. If you use your imagination, do you see a letter R here? I don't know if you can. But the radius is in line with the thumb. And it's circular in shape. The ulna is in line with the pinky, and it has this U shape here. The carpals, metacarpals, and phalange. The carpals are these wrist bones, the metacarpals are the hand bones, and the phalanges are all these different finger bones. And then we've already talked about carpal tunnel in the nervous system. Here's your pelvis. The ilium is kind of the hip bone. The ischium and pubis make up the base, but the ilium you can actually feel above your belt line. The femur is your upper leg bone, and you can see it has a much more prominent head there. And then the tibia and fibula are the lower leg bones. The tibia is the big one, and the fibula is the little one. Think a fib is a little lie. Finally, tarsals are the ankle bones, metatarsals are the foot bones, phalanges are the toes.